Hello. Does that sound okay? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for having us here. Let's get started. Oh, well, I'll give you a note in a second. So we're your presenters tonight. My name is Emily Vinson. I'm the I'm the preservation coordinator at the University of Houston Libraries, but for the last 7 years, I've been the audiovisual archivist in the special collections.
And I'm Mary Manning. I'm the university archivist at the University of Houston, and I also curate the performing arts collection, so music, theater, dance.
And just one note, all the images you'll see tonight come from dance archives, so except for this one, this is me. And probably there are many similar photos in your own personal archives, which we'll be talking about tonight.
So I'm actually going to move this up a little bit because I'm tall. Today's presentation, we're going to do an overview of what archives and archiving is. We're going to look at some resources, and then we're going to have lots of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So, what are archives? They're records created or received by a person, family, or organization and preserved because of their continuing value. They're inactive records of continuing value, and they're organically created records of continuing value. You'll kind of see a theme there with continuing value, particularly when the organization itself maintains the records. That's pretty basic. Archives, the word archives can mean so many different things. There's so many overlapping meanings. When you're talking about archives, specifically, archivists recognize the records, so the materials themselves, the papers or the records, also the facility where they're stored, and the organization that's responsible for both. So the John Peters papers are stored, they're archives, and they're stored in the physical place, the archives, and the organization like Special Collections, who manages it, are also the archives. So it's a word that has a lot of meanings. And mostly we're here talking, that was mostly talking about institutional archives, but you guys here have your own personal and your own institutional archives. You have your own records that you keep for your personal life, but you also have institutional records if you have a company or if you have a school. If you're a choreographer, you'd have your own records as well. How do we care for our collections? How do the archives care for the collections? And how do you care for the collections? It's pretty much the same thing. When you're taking care of your records, you want to describe them, you want to organize them and preserve them, and maybe you'll provide access to them. Somebody else might want to research using your materials from your collections or borrow them or see something that you've done in the past. Describing them, that's really important when you have photographs. Who's in the photographs? What year were they taken? That type of thing. We're going to be talking about file naming later and organizing digital records, which is also super important because a lot of what we're creating today is all digital. I didn't touch the red button, I swear. Okay, let's try this again. So what do you create? Programs, books, administrative records, correspondence, marketing and outreach, posters, journals, photographs, costume and set sketches, textiles, including costumes, moving images. We're going to have a whole section on moving images, both digital and analog, later by Emily. Websites, because a lot of your stuff right now is on the website, isn't it? Social media, and other things. We're going to ask you later at the end what else you have, or what you're most worried about. So we have analog materials that we take in the archives, and we also have digital materials as well. The analog is the paper or the magnetic tape media, cassettes, film, that type of thing, costumes. In the past, we took mostly analog materials. For many years, most collections have been what we call hybrid, which is part analog and part digital. And we're starting to get in all digital collections. And later we're going to look at a screenshot from some folders and files that we got from a very well-organized dance archives. So some of us, I think, are just natural archivists, but we're here to answer any questions you have about that. So mostly when you're taking care of them, you want to keep them cool, dry, and dark. So you don't want to keep things in your attic or your basement, and you even want to take a little bit of care about storing them in the back of your closet too, because a lot of times they don't get enough air. Anywhere where like mold might grow, that's a place where you wouldn't want them. The sunlight can really damage photographs and slides and that type of paper materials. You want to keep things off the floor in case there's a flood, especially in Houston. Store things in non-damaging containers, not ordinary plastic tubs with lids. And a little later, we're in our resources page, we'll have a link to Gaylord. Basically, you want to put things in, if you can, put them in acid-free boxes and folders, if you can, but mostly keep them in a drier, cooler environment. And these also apply to, your cassettes and your film and those type of materials as well. I don't have the touch, apparently. As well as analog materials and digital materials. We have digital materials that are shared online. Why capture it? There's something called link rot. That's when things that are online that you can't get to that link anymore. And I'm sure you've had that happen. You go to click on a link and it just doesn't work anymore. That's link rot. That stuff is here today, gone tomorrow. And the problem with it is a lot of times when we put stuff online, we don't keep it in any other way. Like you actually create that document online, and once it's gone offline, it may not be anywhere at all anymore. There are a couple of tools for that. Archivist is actually really expensive, kind of hard to use, complicated. Big institutions use it. But it's much better for like if you work at a place like the University of Houston and there's, 7 colleges, I don't even think that's right, but many, many programs and departments, and you can't really do by just manually capturing it, but almost all of y'all with your own personal websites or your companies or your school's websites, you can use this very easy to use free source called Conifer. Conifer, it used to be called Web Recorder. And just to let you know that at the end, we're going to give you our email addresses. And if you want a copy of the slides for any of this information, we can get that to you easily. And then I'm going to hand it over to Emily Vinson. You're welcome.
All right. And now I have to lower the mic. Okay. So simply defined, audiovisual materials are recordings that contain visual or sound information and are time-based, meaning they have a duration. Audiovisual materials have played an integral role in documenting our history and providing users with access to cultural, historical, and educational resources. So for example, when I first started in this field, my first job was at New York Public Library, and I was lucky enough to be in the Jerome Robbins dance division, and we had researchers all the time there to study, choreography from the past to inform choreography for the future. So these formats have been crucial in helping to spread ideas across the world. The physical medium of recordings has varied over time, so I didn't know what age this group would be, and I'm used to talking to undergrads, so I'm like, there's this thing called film, but here's a tape. So anyway, film, magnetic media, and optical formats. Each unique media requires format-specific playback equipment. That's key. The signal can be either analog or digital, and each of those things carries with it its own characteristics that can make it challenging to preserve. And essentially, all formats and all playback equipment is proprietary and increasingly inaccessible as new technologies replace old and machines are no longer produced. Additionally, all audiovisual materials and really all archives or all old materials have inherent vices that, if left without proper management, will lead to their eventual loss of the information that they carry. And just as a side note, this is from the collections here at the University of Houston. It's my favorite, one of my favorite things in our whole collection.
You should tell them a little bit.
Oh, sure. So yeah, People Are Taught to Be Different was made in 1958, and it was a collaboration between KUHT, which is at the University of Houston, which is a public educational television station, and TSU. At that point, UH was still segregated, and so once a week, KUHT would drive over to TSU and film this program that was about the universality of human emotion through interpretive dance. And it was written by Henry Allen Bullock, who's a sociologist, and who was a professor there. He went on to be the first Black professor hired at the University of Texas, and then all the cast and crew were all also Black. So you can imagine like that came out of Houston in 1958 as like somewhat remarkable, and it was what was called back then bicycling, which is like distributed across the country to educational stations across the country. And there are 3 episodes on our website if you ever want to check out that choreography, which is gorgeous. So, and it's on film, so we'll start with film. So all motion picture film stock consists of a base layer and an emulsion layer. The emulsion layer is what carries the information. The base layer is transparent and flexible plastic, which supports the image layer. They're binded together with a thin gelatin that's coated in photosensitive emulsion layer, and that protects it from damage. The supports for these layers have changed over time. So nitrate, which if you've ever heard about film spontaneously combusting or setting on fire, that's nitrate. You probably won't come across it. It wasn't in use for very long, and that was kind of at the turn of the 20th century. Cellulose acetate, which is super common. You're going to see a lot of that. And polyester, which is the newest of the film formats, which emerged in the 1970s. Each of these bases has unique preservation concerns. But the overarching rules that are true for all archives are true for this too. Keep in a cool, dry place. Film likes to lay flat like a pancake, not on edge. Yeah, so those are the main things. And the benefit of film, as opposed to the later media that we're going to discuss, is that you can tell what's stored on it by looking at it. So whereas video is a mystery, you only know what's on the label. Film, you have the benefit of at least you can get a hint. If you hold it up to the light, you can tell something about it. Over time, there are a variety of gauges of film available, which is the size. 8 and later Super 8 were the most popular in the consumer market, so those might be the most common, like if you've inherited anything from your parents or grandparents, those are the formats that are most likely to be in your collections. And when stored correctly, film can last for easily 100 years. When improperly stored, film can become brittle, it can become too deformed to pass through a film scanner, and it can develop a condition called vinegar syndrome, which is unmistakable. You'll open the can and you will get hit in the face with the smell of vinegar, and that is kind of the that inherent vice I was talking about. That is the film sort of actively degrading, and that eventually will lead to the film being unretrievable, even through digitization. So now going to video. So a show of hands, how many of you guys have old VHS tapes in a back closet somewhere? Yeah, don't we all? So video, starting with camcorder formats, was like a really major moment in the democratization of video production to consumers. It was the first time that creating moving images was like somewhat more affordable and really easy. You didn't have to go to a place to have film processed. It was really like accessible to everyone. Oh, this is another KUHT production. So this is Dance of Two Countries. They filmed in China, and it was like a pretty big deal in 1981. Video is a versatile term, so kind of like archives can mean many things. So video can mean like a physical cassette, a video. It can mean the thing that's just streaming online. You can video something, so it's an action, a verb. So it's, again, like complicated, and you sometimes need to help people narrow down what they're actually talking about. But we're here talking about like the videotape format, which is magnetic media stored on a carrier. And it's an electronic depiction of moving image. So this is where we get into trouble, where we don't know what we have. So we're relying on labeling, which is a terrible thing to rely on for a lot of things because people are not always great about it. And the only way to understand what's stored on the media is through playback, which can be damaging at times. And the machine has to work, and lots of moving parts within that have to work. So you need playback heads that work. You need cables that connect that video machine to, like, say, a computer to digitize something. The tape needs to be stable enough to play. So if it's been stored in a warm, humid climate, not unlike Houston's climate, it can develop something called sticky shed syndrome. So that's where the sort of magnetic information and the carrier that it's on have shrunken and expanded at different rates of time. And you'll know it when you experience it, because you'll put a tape into play and you'll hear the most awful squealing sound, and you'll immediately stop and you'll think, Emily told me to not play this, and you'll just stop it right there, because what's happening is you're shearing off the information on that tape if you let it play. So it can be recovered. There's you'll have to go to a vendor, but they have lab ovens that can sort of rehumidify the tape at a very low, very gentle, very slow heating process, and that makes it kind of flexible and pliable and binds those two layers back well enough for long enough to get one good play. The process lasts about 2 weeks, and then it starts to go back to that sticky shed, but that gives you the information, so you get another shot. Speaking for the University of Houston's collections, virtually everything from like the 1970s has to be baked before we can play it back, and we use a vendor to do that process. So this is just, this is just a sense of like, you all might be familiar with, say, like Beta or VHS or some of those, but video was like just the Wild West. Like, things were coming out, there were all these like proprietary formats coming out at sort of overlapping times and different sizes, and they could look really similar, but they could obviously not be compatible across different platforms. So just speaking for the University of Houston, in our collections, we have, I would say, over 60 formats. So, it comes with different challenges. And so like that first one, 2-inch tape, that is like literally like the tape is 2 inches wide and about this big and weighs about 30 pounds, and that's like a 30-minute video. And then you think about where we went to, which was like, Digi 8. So it's an amazing process in like a relatively short amount of time. But yeah, just there's safety in like the more popular formats, because it's more likely that there are more machines, and there's more likely that there's more of a drive to like keep those machines operating. But you just get a sense of like the variety that's out there. This is from the Delia Stewart Dance Archives. And so optical media, that also is probably very familiar to you all. That includes things like CDs and DVDs. These formats represented a major advance for consumers, because for the first time, users could create content where you could like skip around through an object rather than having to fast forward and rewind. You could have tracks, and you could like access things in like a non-linear way. It was also like very popular for sharing, so it was fast and cheap and easy to mass produce things. So when CDs and DVDs emerged on the market, they were really like heralded as like the future, like a super stable format. In my career, when I started, I worked at Pacifica Radio Archives in LA, and we were digitizing from like open reel tape, audio tape, to gold CDs that we were promised would last 100 years, which is just like bananas. So anyone, I don't know if any of you have ever tried going back to your like early O's CDs, but there's a great chance that you can't access them now. If they were like produced by like stamped CDs, like they're pretty stable, but if they were like the CDRs or the CDRWs, DVDRs, there's a great chance that they last about 10 years, especially if you like used a Sharpie to write everything about them, and that ink has like kind of migrated into it. So that's another kind of at-risk format. Born digital work, which Mary alluded to, and is really like, I think, in a lot of ways, what we're most worried about, is work that includes components that were always digital and never analog, and it's a huge range of materials. It's everything you create on your computer, everything you create on your phone, all of that is born digital. So I go through some of the file formats, but it's a huge array. So as a little fun exercise, if everyone could get out your telephone, if it's not out already, and navigate to where your photos are. I'll give you a minute. And can you see how many photos, do you see a count for how many photos are on your phone? I know how to do it on an iPhone. Are there more than 1,000? Does anyone have more than 1,000 pictures on their phone? So that's almost everybody. How about more than 5,000? More than 10,000? That's me. I have more than 10,000 on my phone. Yeah. So now we're saying we have between 5,000 and 10,000 pictures on our phone. Now, can you mentally add up, how about wherever you might have other photos stored? On your computer, on your Google Drive, on your Facebook that you uploaded like one night in 2008, on those old CDs that someone handed you from a performance. And what about the videos? So like, you can just imagine, compared to how many VHS tapes you had in that closet, you have like a mountain of information, and how easy is it to find? Are they all called IMG_3726? Yeah. Are there like 6 of them called IMG_3726? _1? Do you have that document that's like _final_final_final_final really final? You know, like, so there's no shame here, we're all in the same boat. So yeah, with technological advances, and particularly access to things like digital cameras and now smartphones, that like explosion that started with video has just like, you know, been put on like gasoline. Like, it's just a massive amount of content, and especially I think when it comes to audio video materials. Also, this is a complicated one because they're relatively invisible. We don't really think about it until our phone is like out of storage and we have to like go and like delete 70 pictures of our dog because there's just like not enough room anymore. We just take it for granted that it's all gonna stay there. Or until like something crashes and then we're like, oh, what now, you know? So they're really easy to lose in that way because we have so much and because we don't know what we have. And oftentimes it's, well, a lot of times impossible to restore things depending on how they're lost. So like that chart I showed with the video formats, this is just for born digital video formats, just to give you a sense. Sometimes we think about like, oh, everything's an MP4, everything's an MOV. That hasn't always been true. Even like MP4s aren't the same now as they were like in the 90s. So like there's always a compatibility issue. So much in the same way you need the right tape deck to play back a tape, you need the right software to play back a video file. I think we've all had that happen where we like open a video and we get like some error that's like, we can't read this codec, or like encoding incorrect, and like what do you as a sort of average user do when you get that kind of message? So this just gives you a sense of that kind of huge variety within like a fairly familiar format of what you might be encountering. And then we have complex digital objects. So it's sort of an extension of the born digital category. Complex digital objects, these are items that are more structurally complex than something like a photograph or a document. So that means something like a single work might contain elements of audio and video, installation guidelines, software, transcripts, and then physical items, such as like projection equipment, speakers, cords, sculptures, and more. This is like often, I'm applying a principle really from like the art conservation world to dance, but I think it's so relevant. So, you know, there's like famous works of art that are displayed through like one, you know, in like the Guggenheim, it's like it's on a video screen that's like the tape machine is from the 1970s. When that machine fails, is it still the same work of art if you project the same video file through a screen made in 2025? Does that change? And so that's where like that documentation part comes in. So if you're imagining a work that one of you have created that has a video element playing, that's where that documentation is so important. Like, does it need to be color corrected? Does it need to be projected onto a certain surface? Does it need to be projected from a certain distance? Does it need to be projected from that projector, or will any projector work? There's all sorts of things to consider. So documentation, which is another digital file almost certainly, is great when you're thinking about your collection, and if it's going to be reused, that information will be invaluable to whoever's researching your materials. So the most effective approach to continued access to both audiovisual and born digital materials is reformatting. This means digitization for those AV materials we talked about, and migration for born digital to more stable file formats. So kind of how we were talking about like that explosion of video files, like right now, like MOVs and MP4s are super stable, and like we can kind of like take some like hope that that will continue to be true. But in 20 years, you might need to reassess and say, like, do I need to move everything off of these like antiquated video file formats and onto a new thing? And like, there's software for that. So for example, Adobe File Encoder, you can often like migrate those file formats forward to more stable formats to ensure like your best resolution and continued access. I'm from rural West Texas, and there's this phrase that I always think of. There's a lot of Southern Baptists, and it's don't be so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. And I feel like that's true here too. Like chasing perfection is like not realistic, especially for an individual. You don't have the resources that an institution have. We often don't have the resources that we need. So like the idea is to try, but I think that you're not going to have everything in the highest resolution format because you're not going to have the storage for that. Like you're not going to have the time for that or the computers, you know, like, and I think that's fine. I think the idea is to like be thinking about it and be thinking about how you're going to continue to access your work. And there are vendors also to help. So if you do have like the budget available for digitization or for migration, that's a great thing to work with, like partners like that. And like Mary mentioned, we have resources not related to vendors, but related to like kind of maintaining digital archives at the end. So another thing is this is the most ephemeral format as we've discussed. So we like the acronym LOCKS, lots of copies, keep stuff safe. In practice, this might look like having things saved on your hard drive, on an external hard drive, on your cloud storage, maybe 2 or 3 places, depending on what's realistic for you. And just a note, like I don't know how I know this is, but like with external hard drives, you can't like put everything on there and then put it in a closet and like not look at it for 10 years. You got to plug it in and like let it spin up every now and again to make sure it continues to work. And if you check it and the files are missing or not opening, that's when you go back to your cloud and you create a second backup on a physical storage. You get rid of that old one and you start a new one because hard drives do fail. And so going back to our little thought experiment about our personal, what's on our phones earlier, and considering how easy or hard it would be to find a specific image of, say, like a specific performance, if the file name is that, like img_7332, that's where file naming and organization is the way we help our future selves or the researchers exploring our archives to make sense of the volumes of data that we're producing right now. So this is an example of a collection that came to us, and it's like a really great example, better than many. You can see like folders that have things that mean something to us, great. You have file names that tell us like the year things happened in and a title, great. That's like a lot more than a lot of people give us, so like this is like a really good example. So you can think of file naming conventions as like a fancy term for a system to name your files in a way that tells you what's in them and how they connect to other files without opening every single thing. So that's called metadata, and we use the naming conventions to keep files in order and make it easy to find them in groups. That's where the folders come in. And I think it's really great, if possible, like that you, before you have like the masses of files, like when you're starting to think about things, you think of that naming convention and then you stick with it once you decide something. So this is like something I might recommend. So think about what's important. The date, I think, is always a great starting point. So we use the ISO format, which is that year, month, date. That way it all sorts nicely in chronological order, because if you do it the other way around, you get like everything from January 1st, but January what year? This way you get it in order. You also, people love to put like spaces and dashes, but like save yourself. You don't need to do them. Just take those out and you save some characters. Title, location, who's on it, what's important to you. Like I'm not suggesting this is the perfect pieces of information for your file formats. I think you have to think about what's important for you. And I think it should be human readable. So like you should be able to tell something about what is stored on that file from looking at that file name as much as possible. So that example that I put below where you consider the order of information, I'm a strong date first person, but that's, you know, preference only. But just keep it consistent throughout your names. You can separate things with either the dash or the underscore, so those like slugs of information can be separated, but avoid spaces and special characters because depending on your operating system, your computer might not like them. You see where people like usually like use like an entire sentence, and it's just like this is not a great way to continue to access information, and then you might switch platforms and then suddenly you have a character limit, so you're losing information in that. And if you have a folder full of, let's say, like a folder full of images, you can always add like a little text document that has a README where you add more information. And so then you're doing, again, like your future self, you're putting a little like note for yourself in the file itself to understand what this was. So I think that's a great way to think about things. And so this is just like a way to think about y'all's role and then our role. They're very, very, very similar. They overlap almost completely. So you are the creators. You've created something. Let's say it's a video. You check it and make sure it actually plays back. I can't tell you how often we get CDs that like, Mary and I had one just the other day, where the CD is labeled and everything, but it was never burned. I can tell that it was never actually, nothing was ever burned to it because of user error. That can happen with anything. You export a file out of a video software, but you don't check it to make sure it really plays back, and maybe it never worked. So go ahead and check it, save it, maybe lots of places if you have the resources, and then you share it if you want to, and you maintain it. So you go back and check it and make sure it's still accessible. And then when it comes to the archives, if it's a collection that comes to the archives, we do much the same process, but you know, with the benefit of more resources usually. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mary. I'm going to try to hand it over to Mary.
I'm glad to know it was not just me who was having trouble, but I'm sorry that you were having trouble with it. Okay, so UH dance collections. And I am a little taller than Emily. We currently have these dance collections. We also have some other we have a hip hop collection and some other collections as well. All of these are the foundational collections for what we're trying to put together. And when I say we, I mean Karen Stokes, who's in the audience today. We started working together before the pandemic, and the project was waylaid because of the pandemic. But we've already started collecting collections. We're also in conversations with really foundational people in the Houston dance community, and we really want to grow the collection. Why would we do this? Well, collections have their own value. They don't actually have values. We have values. But there's a value in a collection, but there's a lot of value in a group of collections. From a group of collections, there's often ways that they intersect, ways that one collection is part of some history and another collection has another part of a collection of that history. And when researchers come, they can really get a full image of what Houston dance is like. So we're really, really hoping to move this project forward this year. As I mentioned, Karen and I have been in discussions with some really foundational people in the community, and we hope to announce this fully this year with a website, a portal page with information on that. So if you have any questions about that, reach out to either one of us. Okay, so why would you give your stuff to an archives, and why would you keep it yourself? The pros of giving it to an archives is that you would clear up some storage space. We often get collections when people are moving. They don't have the same storage space that they used to. They're downsizing. We can give greater access for researchers. An example of that is that the public art program at U of H has these really great Andy Warhol Polaroids, but they really couldn't provide access to them in their department. So we worked with them to provide access in our reading room to them. So it makes it available to more people. A lot of times we're able to digitize things and put them online in a safe way where they can stay there for years and years. And we have preservation copies of it. That's really hard to do when you're an individual or an organization. What I just said about it becoming a larger part of a larger research collection that tells a comprehensive story. Cons, you won't have immediate access to your own archives. Ownership of the physical item is transferred to the repository. Usually, particularly in our archive, the copyright is maintained by the creator. That said, like, let's say that you would want to give us some materials and you weren't sure whether you might need them in 5 years from now. If you find out that you need them 5 years from now, we work with donors to digitize things and provide it to them very quickly as well. But you wouldn't want to give us materials that you're already using, so you would definitely want to hang on to stuff that you're using. And that would be active archives, things that you're using. Post-custodial archives, this is a new model where we've been working with people in communities to help them maintain their own records. There are communities where really the people who should be providing access to their own collections are the people who created them. And sometimes people will eventually give them to the archives, but for a while, the way that people want to represent themselves should be up to those people themselves. Take maybe a community that's not a very well-known community or a misunderstood community. They may want to be very careful about how their image is related. And that also there could be dangers to sharing your archives more publicly too. And that's something you should keep in mind too when you create your own archives or when you give your archives to a repository to share. And there's ways that you can talk to the repository to say, this is stuff. Oh, so we'll go back to that Salamabam. Did I say it right? That was actually a collection we recently received, and you could, if you noticed in the folders, one said restricted for in the reading room only, and one says available to share freely, and that's because we had conversations about that. I think the next slide we talk a little bit more about what I'm about to go into. So copyright and Creative Commons licensing. Why would you maintain your copyright? Well, because you're making money off of it, right? You still plan to do it again. Also, you care about the artistic integrity of that piece still, right? What are some of the dangers of not planning for the legacy of your copyright? There's a saying that copyright has a very long tail. And the idea is that it could be over 100 years before, after your death, that something becomes available to the public and nobody can find the copyright holder. You have orphan works. And so there can be materials that aren't available to historians later on. And those are kind of conversations we can have with you too. And there's ways that you can deal with that. You can deal with that with restrictions. You can say, I freely make this available in 20 years or after my death. Those are really not fun conversations to have, but they're really important conversations to have if you don't want your stuff to be kind of trapped in this long tail of copyright, which you probably don't. But those are conversations we can have. They're kind of very detailed and very particular to every single person. And we'd love to have those kind of conversations with you if you want to start thinking about that. There's also a tool called the Creative Commons license, and it's basically a set of licenses that are, legal, that you can go to their website and you can choose which one matches what you want to do. Do you want to make it available for people to use it exactly as it is if it's credited to you? Or are you okay with people reusing it and remixing what you have? Do you care if people credit you or not? Those type of things. And like I said before, you can make plans for opening up things later or not later. There's a great photographer in Houston who she knows her family wants, she's maintaining her archives. Well, we're maintaining her archives, but if somebody wants to use it, we send them to her, and she's still selling her images. But when she passes away, her family doesn't want to have anything to do with maintaining that business. So she's like, you guys can just make them free to anybody who wants to use them at that point. But these are kind of hard conversations, but things that you have to think about so that things are used the way they want them to be used over time. And we're kind of getting towards the end, and we're going to take turns kind of talking about some of the resources that are available out there. The Joan Mitchell Foundation has a call project that's creating, why can't I ever remember this? Creating a living legacy, creating a living legacy. And they have legacy tools online. And like I said, if you email us, we can get you all of these email addresses. The call project was actually very active in Houston for a while. One of the curators at the Orange Show, Pete Gershon, who's written a lot about Houston art, he was involved with archiving, working with living artists to create their archives. Like he worked with Burt Long while he was living, and they worked with Toby Topek. But their idea is that you should work with your collections while you're living. And you don't even, a lot of the people were older because they really wanted to make sure that those legacies weren't lost. But a lot of their stuff is aimed for protecting your legacy now while you're younger. It's something to start thinking about now. And they have what's called a legacy tool online that can kind of walk you how to do this process yourself.
And the next two that I'm going to mention, there's Electronic Arts Intermix, which is a resource for collecting and preserving video. It's really geared toward artists and creators. And then this next one is Maintenance Culture, which was a National Endowment for the Humanities funded project. We had workshops all over the country. We had one here, which I deeply regret not informing this group about, but it was also for artists. There were a series of workshops, and then what's going to result out of that, which are like forthcoming, they're going to be published in 2024. There's going to be a white paper, a zine, and a podcast that are all geared towards helping artists maintain those complex digital works. And I think that like this audience is like such a great fit for that. It's a different way than maybe it was conceived of it when the trainings were being done, but I think it's like so applicable. So keep an eye on that group. And then, back to you.
Back to me. And then it will be back to you. Yeah. So this is a great organization for dancers, Dance USA. I know you all have heard about them. And they have very rich resources on their archiving and preservation page. And they also have a legacy toolkit, which can really basically walk you through how to archive dance records. Gaylord Archival is a place where you can buy acid-free folders and acid-free boxes, but I kind of was thinking, as Emily was talking, it is do what you can. I think I was trying to get that point across. You know, keep things in the best environment you can keep it in, but don't worry if it's not a perfect environment. You know, if you can afford acid-free boxes, that's great, but if not, you know, just keeping things cool and dry and not in the sun, you know, and off of the floor and not wet, you know. So you do what you can, you know. And then the last one is.
So speaking of off the floor and not wet, Texera, Texas Collections Emergency Resources. So there's some really great resources for organizations, but also for individuals around disaster recovery and response. There's also National Heritage Responders, and I'm actually part of that group, so it's a nationwide volunteer organization, and there are phones manned all the time. So if you ever have like an event, a fire, a water emergency, whatever it is, you can call and get very specific advice on how to handle the media you're working with. So if it's a costume, how to dry it out. If it's a video, if it's a photograph, really best steps for mitigating what kind of damage there is and if there's recovery as possible. Because a lot of times you'd be surprised what can be recovered following it, especially, we always talk about water, but there's other types of disasters, there's pests, like there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. So, but there's people to help. Yeah. There's help available. It's all free. So
That's National Heritage Responders?
yeah. So through Texera is like sort of a Texas-specific subgroup of that. So you can, their website has a phone number, and you can get in touch with them. And if you do need help, you can think about that. But really, prevention is like your best policy. So storage is great. And like, if you know where your water pipes are, like, don't store your most precious belongings under those like, you know, whatever. So we all live in Houston. We know what we're talking about. Okay, so I'll let you take over.
No, we're doing this part together. Yeah. So I just thought of these questions. I don't know how helpful they are. So if you have your own questions, feel free to interject. But what type of records or documentation do you and your organization create? And what kind of records or documentation are you worried about? What questions do you have about that? So what type of materials that you have in your collection were you most worried about when we were talking? I'm going to go with the stress thing. Old videos?
Old video footage, yeah.
Yeah.
Any kind of old video footage, beta, VHS, lots of, you know, dances are stored. Historic things are stored on the old videotapes and DVDs, frankly. Also, I'm going to say something that may not be politically correct in terms of thinking about archiving, but 10,000 photos that you may have on your phone, ultimately, who cares? Goodbye. I mean, that not everything has to be saved, and not everything will be saved. So deciding, you know, like, oh, these are important to me, but all of this dreck can just be, you know, ashes to ash. Yeah. Sorry, that's probably politically incorrect, right?
I don't think it is at all.
You know, making those decisions.
A big part of being an archivist is throwing things away. Because you're absolutely right. You don't need like 70 almost identical pictures, and that's where the hard work for you guys comes in, is like finding what you actually want to keep within that. No, I think that you're absolutely right. We love to throw things away in the archive. Oh, it's like so satisfying. Like, why are there 25 copies of this program? We need 2. That's fine. Like, we don't need to keep all of them. So I couldn't agree more. Like, the truth is that like we have this like avalanche of information, but how do we know what's important if the creators aren't telling us what's important?
Yeah. I remember going to a talk about 15 years ago, and the talk was on the amount of photographs that we have now, digital versus what we used to have, because when you took photographs before, the film was expensive, right? And then you had to have it developed, which was expensive. So you were very careful about what you took pictures of, right? And when you got it home, you could actually write on the back of it, to the left, Aunt Maud, to the right, Little Johnny, 1976. But all that gets a lot harder to do when you have thousands of photographic files. So yeah, do get rid of the dreck. You know, figure out which one of the two of the 70 pictures of your dog are the most adorable and give them a file name, you know. 2021 0102. You don't have to do that. And I like dashes instead of underscores, but you know, and then put, you know, I don't know, what Little Muddy, you know, and you know, and so you know what it is. You can look at it and you say, oh, that's 2021, and that was my dog, you know. But you know, you can't tell what the other 1,000 pictures are because you can't even read from looking at them. But yeah, so it's actually really important is to get rid of the stuff you don't need and describe what you have, because nobody has the time to do file names for 1,000 photographs. And, yeah, so I think that's really important. So what formats are you creating right now? How many people are creating mostly paper right now? How many people are creating mostly digital records right now? And how many people are creating kind of a mix of both of them? Yeah, that's yes, the mix has been most popular with what we're getting, but we get things kind of down the road, well, sometimes we get things when they're pretty new, but a lot of times, it's been a decade or two. But we really are starting to get a lot of collections in that are all digital. But you'll always have like posters and mailings and, well, maybe not, we're kind of moving towards a purely digital world. And the digital stuff is the most ephemeral. And the irony in that is that we actually make preservations of things, digital copies of AV, magnetic tape media, but we have to make 3 copies of them, and we have to check them all the time to make sure that there hasn't been bit rot, and then create new copies if they had. So this has to be like an automated system when you have millions of files. And quite frankly, institutions are still working at it. Only, like MITs and places like that really, and they still don't have it down yet, but we're working towards it. So we preserve by digitizing, but digital is also really hard to preserve. So we're kind of in that conundrum right now. Do you want to speak to that? Because
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to like the institutional model we have. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with what a checksum is, but it's like an automated process where every file has like a unique code, and it gets run against this sort of like master list. And if that number matches, the file hasn't changed at all. And if that number changes, you get an alert, and that something about that file has changed. And so you need to go back to one of your other copies to replace it. So that's like sort of an automated system. We pay for preservation systems that do that work for us. Like Mary said, there's no way to like open files and observe the bit stream and make sure that it's like true. So like we are fortunate to have that kind of resource available to us, and there are like really smart people working on like the models that help us maintain and hopefully ensure access for as long as possible.
Yeah, definitely. So what challenges are you having with maintaining your archives? Honestly.
Or are you maintaining yet? Yeah.
I'm pretty sure everybody in this room, it's time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Space? Sometimes space?
Yeah.
And we have trouble with our own records too.
Yeah.
So. like my personal records at home, it's like the carpenter's house is always in disorder.
Absolutely.
Right?
And if if you've moved a lot in your life, like that makes it really hard. Like so many sort of life factors makes maintaining your collection really challenging, beyond just like your computer hard drive failed. Like literally, like if you just like, have had a life where you've had to move every couple of years, like that is a hindrance. And that's sort of why sometimes historically archival collections lean towards, maybe wealthy people, because there's like a stability in being able to afford storage that isn't always accessible to everyone else. So I think that physical space is can be very hard to maintain. Or if the best thing you have is like a storage locker in Houston, you can imagine the kind of collections that might come out of that sort of space. Perhaps not as great.
I don't know how we're going for time. Do we have time for questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Okay. And there's no such thing as a stupid question.
Okay, so I have a weird question.
I like weird questions.
Weird question. Okay. So we, Dawn and I, are part of Milby High School. Emily, we've been emailing back and forth. Nice to meet you in person.
Nice to meet you.
Our high school was founded in 1926. Our drill team originated as a pep squad in 1926, evolved into a drum and bugle corps. We're researching documentation and finding it. The two challenges we have is, one, we're finding publications that we want to scan or digitize and put in our cloud so that we can record and present this history. But how do we don't have a machine to scan a book or a publication.
I have an answer for you.
Okay, and my second weird question is, we have found videos on YouTube. I found a 14-minute video of co-ed cadets marching through downtown in a parade in 1958, and then it disappeared. And I guess I didn't copy it or download it, but it's gone away.
Yeah. People always say things like, "Oh, it's saved to YouTube," and I just say, "Oh no!" Like,
Yeah, it's a very painful lesson to have your
Yeah, it
video go away on
absolutely is.
YouTube, and you're like, that was a 14-minute video that my best friend's mom was in when she was
Yeah.
17 years old, and we found it, and it's like, poof, it's just gone away. It's
Yeah.
like, how do you call YouTube and go give it back?
Yeah.
You
And
know?
who put it up there in the first place, and how did they get it? Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Right.
So I don't have an answer for question 2, unfortunately, other than just keep looking because maybe it'll come back. But for the first question, the public library here in Houston has these locations called TechLink locations, and they have they're like technology libraries. Like, they don't have book collections, they have technology collections. So they have things like scanners and the software you need to do the scanning, and they're awesome. I really recommend those. I mean, you could, if you have a lot of money, you can also pay vendors, but I think if you have time, that's a great option and free. But the missing YouTube video, I'm not sure, unless you can somehow know who the.
I have a screenshot of the user.
Oh, you know what? I would
Name?
I would message them. Or are they still? Do they still have a profile?
You can message people on YouTube. This
Yeah.
is how ignorant I am. I have no idea.
It's not ignorant. It's just something you
Yeah.
haven't done before.
Yeah.
Yeah. Message them and just see what happens. And maybe you'll find out that they have a connection and they're going to be excited about this project too. And they'll say, "Oh, like, my grandmother was in that video. Like,
Her
do
mother
you want
was
to
in
talk to her?"
Yeah, her mother was in the video. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is just like me going on a total riff, but I also am a big fan of recording the older generation. So as much as possible, getting recordings with the earlier, members of the team and keeping those available to people.
It's funny that you said that, because the first thing we started doing is we started recording oral histories of our living legacies.
Yeah, I think that's incredible.
1958 graduates, 1959 graduates. We just started recording with a phone or camera and just asking them questions about what was it like when you tried out for the co-ed cadets. What did you do? And
Yeah.
what was your position? And what instrument did you play? Because they played lyres and drums and bugles, and they were swing flags. And
Yeah,
it was just,
I think that's the most powerful kind of, often the most powerful part of archives are those oral histories. And then you have all these other sort of elements to kind of support that story, but that individual story is I don't know, unbeatable to me.
Yeah.
I'm a sap, I'll just cry about anything, so
we all cried. Yeah, you had graduates from the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s listening to someone who's 1958, and it's a sisterhood that's a bond. It's really indescribable that you wore the very same costumes, you walked in the same fields, you walked on the same halls.
Yeah.
We didn't realize our organization was that old until we learned about it. But so now we're trying to research and preserve our history.
Awesome.
Yeah, and this oral histories, they definitely, even if you had a very strong paper archives, they really kind of fill the holes in the paper archives that give you information that wasn't there, and also kind of give you that personal experience part of it. And I think in much older archives, you would get things like correspondence where people talked about what was going on in their life, and and people would journal, and people don't do a lot of that anymore. So oral histories really fill that function too.
In a very novice way, we put things in two different categories: the publications, the yearbooks, the competitive sheets, but then we do the what do we call it? The traditions on the other side, which is something that's not publicized, but it's like the memories. Are there better words for that? That is not publication. That's more.
I think it's fine. I mean, yeah, I think if that's what makes sense to you, because you have to think about we talk a lot about descriptive words, and you have to use the words that make sense to you. So if you use all official words, for example, this is a really silly example, but early in my career, I worked at New York Public Radio, and the official term was sewerage, not like sewers, like sewerage. And it's like no one's ever gonna like come to our database and be like, I need to know about sewerage, because no one uses that word. You know, like it's a ridiculous thing. So I think you should use something that makes sense, and if it makes sense to you, it'll probably make sense to your audience, is my opinion.
Yeah, and like when we what comes to mind when you say that is that there was a great band leader named Bill Moffett who was at U of H for a long time, and we got a lot of help from people from the marching band to describe what was in those records, because their whole terminology and their language wasn't what we would call things. So it was actually processed, and I knew it was described poorly with my limited amount, but we got in the people from that community and said, what do marching band people call this?
Yeah.
And so, I'll be definitely calling on you guys to say, hey, I processed this, and are these like described in terms that you would use, that you would follow? We have all sorts of thesauri, and if we're cataloging something and getting it into the Library of Congress catalog records, we got to use those terms, but we can also use
Local vocabulary.
Yeah. Lay terms, things or professional terms that are used in the field.
Yeah.
I would even add that one of the challenges is that we have all these pictures. You got a 97-year-old institution, and obviously be 100 pretty soon, and the pictures change throughout. For instance, the panoramics. Some of them are this size, and so on and so forth. And I think that at some point we would actually want to have them all made to the same sides, and whatever the case may be. And obviously the people who did them back in the 1950s are probably no longer with us, or they're not the same company. And something to even to bring them to where we can all make them all the same at one point in time. And I would assume another 50 years from now there'll be another
Absolutely.
trek and try to get those that way.
That is a real challenge, those oversized materials, because it's such a specialized equipment. So that is going to be something that you may not be able to DIY, because there are like places here in Houston that specialize in that kind of thing. Like Bayou Fine Arts is one I've heard of, but like, because you need like these like kind of rigs to do that sort of thing, like overhead cameras and huge tables, and like sometimes depending on the length, they might need to be like digitally stitched together, because they make sometimes those photos that are like, 8 feet long, and there's no scanning system that's going to accommodate that. So there are for sure challenges, and even storing something like that is such a challenge. Like,
presenting something like that digitally is also a challenge too, because if something is, this wide, if you put it on the standard size screen, it's going to reduce it to where it's going to be really hard to see what's on it, and then if you sort of have to scroll through it, it's going to be kind of hard to find where you are in it. So there are workarounds where you have like a little square so you can see where you are, but you still don't get that whole panoramic situation. So not everything can be digitized completely well. It doesn't take the place of the original.
Yeah, you can't emulate the experience of looking at something
or
like
turning
that.
a page of something that's made with vellum animal skin, or is made with a really fine cotton, or being able to see the watermark in the back. These are pretty precious things, right? But to take a picture, even to have some three-dimensionality to it of a ballet shoe is not the same as looking at one or touching it, right? There's a lot that's actually also lost in digitizing things.
Yeah.
It's real, it's kind of a way to make things available to more people and kind of democratize things, but not really in certain ways. That's why we do things, so that more people can use it, but more people can use it if they have computers, So that is what we do, and that's what we do to make things more available. It's the way to preserve things and to share it more widely. But That was really depressing, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
there are limitations. Ending on a low note.
But it's great if we can keep
Yeah.
the shoe, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to throw away the shoe after we digitize
Yeah,
it.
and that's crucial. Like with digitization, with everything we do, we don't ever get rid of the original. We always maintain the original, and then we consider the digitized thing the surrogate. So it's not a replacement. And with if someone comes in, they can still always, in the professional setting, they can still always see the original because we understand the value of the physical object as well. Yeah.
Yes, and I guess I'll add a tip. One of the slides you had earlier, I'm a Texas historian, and so I went all over all 254 counties, and twice actually, and I did one for just the counties, and then I did the next one for all the county courthouses. And through my times, I took, I did all of those counties, and I did the pictures, and I tell you the best thing that you can do is as soon as you get through with your day's journey, because I do about 20 or 30 counties a day, you process the pictures immediately.
Yeah,
Because if you don't, it'll pile up too much.
absolutely.
You'll end up with
They'll all blur
thousands and
together.
thousands.
And that's what we tell people when they come to use the reading room too, is if you take a bunch of notes and pictures with your phone, particularly people if they're coming in from out of town and they're there all day, we're just like, you should really go back to your hotel room, right after dinner and look at these things and start describing them and storing them and putting them in folders, and because like 2 months from now you're not have any idea.
It's not going to mean anything to you. Yeah, absolutely.
And the one other thing that just like you said, you definitely want to make sure you take a look at it, because I did have a picture of a county that's close to Loving, which is close to El Paso. Now I'm back here in Houston, and I didn't get good photos of that particular county
Right.
over there. As a matter of fact, it was Def Smith. Yeah,
It's a long way to go to fix a bad photo.
Yes, and so I was going to just use a YouTube. I mean, something that was already known. It's not fair if you're, considered to be a true historian. And so I say, if you're going to take pictures, you want to view them before you leave the area.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that way.
Absolutely.
Over here.
Has there been any intersection between like virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, and archiving?
So that's a good question. There is some projects that I'm aware of. Like I know the BBC did one that's like pretty cool. It's called 1942 or something like that, and it like uses, because the BBC is like preeminent as far as audiovisual collections go, so they use all this news footage to like, and then you put on VR goggles and you're like immersed in a bombing, and it's like pretty incredible, and they use it like as an educational tool. There are a few projects like that I'm aware of. That's what comes to mind.
Yeah, I kind of wonder about archiving AI type stuff. Like, is anybody like documenting the answers that people get from chat bots?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know about that at all. But that is kind of an interesting thing to think about, because it's definitely a part of our everyday living experience right now. Or, are they creating transcripts of what those chatbots say, and are those archived and maintained in any way? And you're talking about a lot of data there.
Yeah.
And when you get into data too, that's also another thing that's really hard to maintain and preserve. And that's kind of a related but different field than ours, is maintaining statistics and numbers from experiments, from medical stuff, and maintaining really, really, really large bodies of data, and how to visualize that and see what's in those huge clouds of information. Way over my head. But yeah, I think when you start getting into these really large bodies of data, it really becomes kind of hard to figure out what's important to save and what's not. A lot of times what we do is, if we have really large bodies of stuff that we physically cannot maintain, is that we do selections of things, maybe a period of time, or Yeah, I kind of wonder about, how do we document, what AI is actually producing, you know?
And then another kind of like other angle of the answer to your question, I know there's in the Netherlands there's their Sound and Vision. It's like their film archive, and it's like super ambitious. Like they have like digitized everything the country has produced, like state produced audiovisual. It's very well funded as opposed to places here, and they're like very cool, of course, and they've experimented with using AI to do the descriptive work. So like using machine learning to understand what's happening in a video or in a photograph to create the descriptive work rather than humans looking at every single thing. But as anyone who's like used AI transcription services knows, like they are imperfect. So like, I don't know that I would like rely on that, but I know that that's like sort of something that's being toyed with as like a tool rather than as like using the archives as part of a like virtual reality thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess you get to that thing where even a bad transcript, if you're looking for keywords across it, it might get you to what you're looking for.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? But it's certain, and with really big bodies of data, they just have to kind of look for trends between things to kind of know what's going on in that big body of data, because you can't actually look at everything. But hopefully none of your collections are like that. We got a little ethereal there.
Yeah. But you can always email us. Oh, that's on the next slide.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We're happy to chat and discuss things and I don't know. Share resources.
Karen, do you want to talk a little bit about the Dance Project?
Sure.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Where we are right now, having had some initial meetings in Houston, and I guess what I'd like to say about it, that it's an inclusive thing that is just starting, and that if you have any interest at all in sharing some of your collection with the Houston Dance Archives, we have actually named it Houston Dance Archives. Mm-hmm. So that's been kind of approved by the University of Houston. Mm-hmm. And so that's the word, the term you could use, and you say we would be interested in sharing a part of our collection or a whole collection with the Houston Dance Archives. And Mary is your go-to person primarily. I got started on this with Mary prior to my retirement as director of dance at the University of Houston. So I was working on this, like she said, we lost a major archive in dance with the Jewish Community Center Dance Month because of Harvey. And so it was sort of a kick in the ass, We were like, oh my God, we cannot have, because that was a thing that a lot of performers from the 70s forward performed every year, and it was just a huge archive of a lot of dancers and choreographers in Houston over a long period of time. And so that was kind of, there are some archives from that program that are saved that we're going to be able to get through Maxine Silberstein of the JCC, but nevertheless, a huge portion of that was lost because of Harvey. And so that was something I think that motivated us a little bit to say, hey, and also I keep noticing how we're all aging. And I'm like, there's a lot of people that are 2 generations above me that are passing on, and I want to make sure we get their work to the library about Houston, particularly about Houston and our dance scene here, which I think is underrepresented. There's a lot of things going on in Houston that I have no idea about in dance that would be great to be housed at the Houston Dance Archive. So I think the main thing is just if you have any interest in that or you know of anybody that might be interested in that, please email Mary so that she can make sure that we're looping you in. Because what we did at the beginning was have a few group meetings, and that was actually really fun.
And Molly, I
'Cause
think might be a good resource for us once we
Yeah.
have the page up. Can we share it maybe through
And,
DanceSource Houston?
and also, by the way, DanceSource Houston is in the process of collecting their archives and putting it at Houston Dance Archives. And there's a number of, things that, because we were very much like, DanceSource Houston now has become a resting place for a lot of activities that happen in Houston dance-wise. So I just think
what
it's
you're saying about it being inclusive.
it's very inclusive.
Every kind of dance from every kind of, and,
Yeah.
and if you,
And my area is contemporary dance, so there's a lean into that right now, but it's not unintentional. It's intended to be very inclusive of all forms of dance in Houston.
and you don't have to be ready to donate everything you have. There may be older things that you that you never ever use that anymore that is valuable, or it could be, you keep a couple of programs, maybe give us one of each of them. It could be, it could be you have digital video and you're ready to give us a copy. We can work with you to kind of maybe do one portion of it at a time so that it's manageable for you, because like you said, we don't have the time. But the more proactive you are, the less likely things are to get lost. And yeah, so talk to us, even if you, so the whole point of this was that, and I hope it came off of that, is that we were talking to you about what we do in the archives, but mostly we want to help you preserve your own archives too. So, please reach out to us as a resource. Sometimes we can help and sometimes we can't help, but we can at least lead you to somebody who can help, So, we just wanted you to start thinking of your records as archives, because y'all are producers of archives.
I'll just add one more thing that you reminded me of, because I had this idea at one point that Houston Dance Archives should, when we're collecting information, also be thinking about collecting programs, because a lot of times we have programs for whatever you did over a course of the year. And inside that program are names of dancers, names of people, and it's a time period, and descriptions sometimes also of the work that's being done. And so I think I kind of, it's hard to do that totally, because everybody collects their information in different ways. But I do think that if you do have programs, like they said, 2 copies, or if it's hard copy or whatever, that kind of material just gives such a good overview of particularly people who have been working in Houston and dance over the years.
So if that's what you're, if that's the only part that you're really ready to all that's in files, you have a couple extra copies of those, maybe you'll want to start with that, before you want to deal with your thousands of photographs, because if you give us digital ones that has no description, we can work with you to describe them, but we'll probably not have any idea of what they are.
Yeah.
And we've always had that problem with photographs, but it's like 1,000-fold now with digital.
When we went back to the 1926 Milby yearbook, we started recording the names of everybody who participated in the drill team of every year. We're typing those up. And sometimes the publication of a yearbook in 1938 only had a first name. It didn't have a last name, a first name and a last name initial. So we are recording those names, and what we're doing is we're putting our work on a website to share, because you've got co-eds all over the world, right, who've been going to school since 1926, 1938, 1958, 1948. The other thing we're doing is, as a nonprofit, we are investing our time in the East End community, supporting financially the schools that have dance programs now. They didn't have dance programs when we were in school. when we were there, it was extracurricular after school, and you learned something and you taught somebody else. And now Milby, Dee Dee have dance programs with dance instructors. And so we're trying to fund them, like we're delivering a monitor and a TV stand for the dance room tomorrow. Because from an instructional standpoint, she said that's the one thing she really wanted, was something to push play to help her teach her classroom. And last year there was 5 students, this year there's 14 students, so we hope to fund them any way we can, whether it's wish list and things like that. And the cultural aspect of the East End community in dance, you probably won't get a program sometimes, but I will tell you, every Dia de los Muertos, there are Ballet de Florico dancers everywhere on the Harrisburg, or Old Town Harrisburg, or Magnolia Park. And that, I think, is something that we're trying to make sure that we are keeping abreast of, because the dance community's diverse. And we're excited because it's always been there. Yeah, I'm 54. When I was 5, they taped things to my head so I can dance on stage. It's always been there. It's just not been recorded.
Yeah.
Not like it should be.
Well, and I think that's why in that model, that share it part is so important, because like it disseminates the information. And I think like you're saying the names, like I'm working on a project right now that's digitizing and publishing like 3,500 hours of LGBT radio made in Houston since 1970 on. And if it weren't for this website that has all these names for me to look up, I would never, and newspapers, old newspapers that have them written, I would never be able to spell any of these names, because you just listen and you're like, how would I ever know what they're saying? You know, like, so I think what you're doing of like documenting those names is like a very valuable thing, because you're going to be able to trace like, you know, you could even look, there's this thing called Texas Digital Newspaper Project, which is like scans of newspapers made across Texas for like the last 100 years. And they're mostly like out of print, so like teeny tiny little newspapers. But if you have names, you can search for them, because they're all searchable. They're all OCR, which is optical character recognition. So you might be able to track down some of your dancers appearing in the newspaper, you know, in the 30s. So that's a very valuable research tool. Yeah.
And like you were saying, that's what the programs do too. The programs kind of
Exactly.
give you a list of all of the dancers, and you know.
And then
how
you can maybe
spell
trace
their
a
names.
dancer
Yeah.
through their career using all these different things together.
And that's the value of having a lot of dance collections in one place.
Absolutely.
Because you can find this dancer here.
And then
you
they
can
moved
find
over
this
here.
dancer here, and you can find this dancer here.
Yeah.
So there's always a value in a collection, you know, an added value, a plus value for having multiple items that can reference each other.
Are we out of time? Yeah.
How are we doing on time?
I think we're out of time. But we're happy to talk, but
Yeah.
also want to be respectful.
We're okay?
If there are any more
Okay.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you guys very much for coming, and thanks for telling us what y'all are doing, because it's been fascinating to hear.
Agreed.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Mary. Thank you all so much for joining us and for playing along with using the microphone. None of us like to do it.